And I can probably talk hours about, not advocating for free labor because when I took it, it actually took some internal advocacy to switch it and make it a paid internship. And so, I think when I look back on those specific years, it was very much a grind and hustle chapter of my life where, even when I would just go on walks or I would go deliver some mail or something, whatever my task was as an intern, I'd be like, oh, this is a lot of work, but it'll be worth it one day. And I have to say it was. I learned a lot, but it's part of the journey,
Welcome to Career Cheat Code. In this podcast, you'll hear how everyday people impact the world through their careers. Learn about their journey, career hacks, and obstacles along the way. Whether you're already having the impact you want or are searching for it, this is the podcast for you. On today's episode, we have someone who works as a public affairs manager at one of America's largest healthcare providers. Let's start the week with Brian Lucero Contreras. All right, Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Radhy. Good to be here. How you doing?
Good, doing good. I know, I think you and I hit it off immediately when we met out in San Francisco, and, it's good to have you on here and share some of your path, some of your work and accomplishments today so that folks can kind of learn from your journey. So thanks for coming on board.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, let's dive right in. Let's tell the world what it is you do for a living.
Yeah, so currently I am the public affairs manager for Kaiser Permanente's Golden Gate service area here in Northern California. And so for folks who might not be aware what Kaiser Permanente is, it is a large integrated healthcare system in the U.S., serving about 12.7 million members through its network of hospitals, physicians, and through its health plan. And so they operate in 8 different regions across the U.S.
So what does that mean on a day-to-day basis? What is it that you do?
Yeah, so I wear many hats. My primary role is overseeing our community relations strategy for San Francisco and Marin counties. So everything from event sponsorships, community engagement, and stakeholder engagement and volunteerism, all of that kind of falls under my portfolio. So making sure that, Kaiser Permanente is being a good corporate citizen in the different geographies that we operate, primarily here in the Bay Area.
Is this what you always wanted to do for a living?
It's not what I always wanted to do. I would say it's, as I got older and kind of progressed in my career, I think it's something I always hoped I would do. So I definitely feel very blessed to be in the role that I'm in. I think I originally, when I was in high school, wanted to be a journalist. And so how I ended up in this role was kind of by mistake, coincidentally, I would say, but I'm very blessed to be doing the work that I do.
Got it. So tell me about your upbringing. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And in high school, when you wanted to be a journalist, kind of what led you to either work towards that path or deviate upon graduation?
Yeah, so I'm in the Bay Area now, so I'm based in San Francisco, but I'm originally from Southeast LA. I grew up in Southgate, California. So born in Linwood. I think about 1 year old, we moved to Southgate, which is just a neighborhood over. It's about 8.5 miles southeast of downtown LA for those who are not on the West Coast or in California. And yeah, I grew up in Southeast LA. I went to high school at Loyola High School, which is in downtown LA. It's a private Jesuit high school. And from then on, went to Cal State LA for college. And so I would say I grew up in, I call it the hood, it's depending on who you ask in LA. It's right next to Compton, North Long Beach area, and taught me a lot about kind of who I was later in life. I would say I rep Southeast LA pretty hard. And yeah, so I would say when I got to high school, I was in yearbook. I was in our yearbook team in high school. And I remember I've always been sort of this comms guy. Like I've always enjoyed English, even growing up in grade school, elementary, middle school. I always gravitated to English as my favorite subject. And then when I got to high school, I would say I slacked off a little bit in high school, but what I gravitated towards, what I was actually really interested in was always sort of the arts. Like I took a photography class, really into that. That led me to ask if I can get on the yearbook staff. And that led me to take, photos and being our photographer. And then exploring just what that meant on the writing side of things. And so by the time I got to college, I definitely was exploring avenues around how to do sort of the communication studies major.
Got it. Okay, so walk me through this. So you're about to graduate high school and you have this plan, like I'm going to be this journalist because I've done yearbooks and I know what this looks like and I know how to write. You graduate. What happens immediately after? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing between that senior year and are you going straight to college? What are you doing?
Yeah, so I always had this dream of going to USC. I'm gonna be 1,000% real. I didn't have the grades to get in, and so the vision that I had set myself out through high school didn't really pan out. Once I graduated, I ended up deciding to do 2 years at a community college. So I went to Santa Monica College, which was on the completely other side of town. But I think at the time Santa Monica had the highest transfer rate to USC and UCLA. And so in my head, that was like the perfect strategy to, go to SMC for 2 years, transfer, get to USC, go to their school of journalism and figure it out that way. Didn't work out. So I think what seemed pretty easy in my head, very quickly, my reality was just very different. There was a lot going on around that time. So I don't usually blame it on anything. I just think that at the time, I was going through a few different challenges at home and just figuring out what I wanted to do and who I was, like personally, and my identity too. And so I think all of that kind of culminated into one right as I was like becoming a senior. And so I think it took a toll on it, but ultimately going to Santa Monica College was, I think, one of the best decisions I could have made because it allowed me the time to really explore some of my interests, what I wanted to do. At SMC, I took a lot of classes that were focused. Well, I was following the USC plan, but I took a lot of classes that were really focused around communication and political communication. So I remember taking a politics of film class. And that really opened my eyes onto how visual media could be a vehicle for communication and political engagement. And, I should backtrack a little bit. In high school, in the areas that I wasn't really applied to, the areas that I did kind of apply myself to were community service and volunteerism. And so because I went to a Jesuit high school, they were very big on, making sure that all students complete a certain number of volunteer hours each year. And so I took that with me even after I graduated, and in every role and everything that I've done, I think since I've integrated that into part of who I am. And so jumping back into Santa Monica, I remember a lot of my sort of activist in me that I wanted to be kind of gravitated towards finding something that was the middle between communications and politics. And so usually that's kind of like a poli-sci type of thing, right? And so I was like, all right, let me do a major in communications and a minor in poli-sci. And so that was sort of my track. Yeah. And when it came down to it, when it was time to transfer again to USC, I didn't get in a second time. And so it completely rerouted me and what I thought I was going to do. And my biggest mistake, I think at the time, as I saw it, was I followed the USC transfer plan, but didn't follow the UC transfer plan. And so my options were very limited in what I could apply to because I hadn't taken the prerequisites for the UC system.
Interesting.
And so all that to say, I found myself in a weird predicament of like, well, this is twice now that this has happened to me. What's going on, right? In high school, I connected with an alum of my high school who went on to become a mentor of mine. And right around the time where I was applying to transfer to schools, he had recommended a program to me in DC. Okay, there's this now that you're interested in politics, there's this program in DC that I think you should do. And I remember when he first told me about it, I was like, no, it's not for me. Like, I don't have time. I just want to do the 2 years and get out of here. And he convinced me. And honestly, that ended up being what kind of just served as a catalyst and the switch in me to see like, hey, there's something more out there for you. Like, I think you need to start like getting your stuff together and start exploring that. And so that's sort of how things took a turn for the better, I would say.
So before we get into that program, was there a moment in your life or something that happened that made you want to get into politics in some way, shape, or form? Like the communications angle seems more of a direct line when you're good at English, right? And when you are doing yearbooks and things like that, and you're like, oh, I can communicate. I know how to do this, right? That seems more progressively linear. Was there anything that made you really want to get politically active?
Yeah, when I was a junior in high school, there was a trip that my high school organized to DC. And around that time, immigration reform was a hot topic. And they essentially trained us how to lobby for immigration reform. And I remember I was really connected with that group because of my community service leadership time. And so I went on that trip to DC, and it just opened my eyes to like the congressional process and lawmaking, and the fact that anyone can go and advocate for certain issues. And for me, that was a topic really close to home. And so I remember after I did that, when I got to college, I was like, all right, well, let me explore how I can continue to build off of that experience and make an impact in other ways. And in my head, I wanted to go back to DC. I was like, oh, that was a great experience. What else is there for me to do? How else can I show up as a leader? So I would say that particular experience definitely kind of piqued my interest a lot.
That makes sense. So fast forward, now you're in college, you're talking to this person who you met before, who is somewhat serving as a mentor figure for you at the time. And they tell you about this program. Tell me about the program itself and tell me what your role led to with that.
Yeah. So the program is called the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, otherwise known as CHCI. It's a program in DC. It's an organization in DC that really its mission is to develop the next generation of Latinx leaders. And so my mentor connected me to the program because he was working in DC at the time. And I guess his boss was connected to the organization in some way, shape, or form. And so by the time I got to apply and I got accepted, they have different programs. One of them is an internship program, and they essentially fly you out to DC for a 3-month internship, and they pay for your housing and they pay for you to work on Capitol Hill. And so for me, coming from Southeast LA, where I didn't even know that these types of opportunities existed, that was really eye-opening. I was the only community college student in my cohort. I was the second youngest in my cohort of I think 12, and the only queer person in my cohort. And so at that time, I remember it just feeling like this is an opportunity that's going to allow me to grow, be my true self in a new space, and just learn, right? And so, it was 3 months. It was a fall internship. And I was placed with the office of Congresswoman Linda Sanchez. And that, I would say, was the experience that solidified my interest in not only political communication, but strategic communication and public relations, which is what I went to school with for.
What were you actually doing during that internship? And you're out there in DC by yourself, right? So like, was your plan to potentially stay there afterwards, or did you have to come back because you got to finish school? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, because I was the youngest and I still had to transfer. And so I still had to come back and finish school. But in the Congress member's office, I started off as an intern, and then very quickly, at the time, it was during Obama's reelection. And so I remember there was a few offices that were also running for reelection, and they were one of them. And at the time, my Congress member was running for second vice chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And so what that meant is there was just a lot of opportunity to insert yourself in certain spaces and conversations and initiatives for the office. And for me, I was really interested in social media. I was like, well, there's no one's really doing much on social media at the time. So I kind of raised my hand and was like, well, can I help draft some tweets or do some, social media research on some of the debates that you're going to be talking about? So it began as like regular constituent outreach, and then it turned into becoming the press intern for her office and working really closely with their communications director. And it was a great opportunity. I really enjoyed that.
That's a great way to leverage your skill sets, your interests, and the space that you are, or the environment that you're in, right? Like, I know how to do this. I think it would be an added benefit to this Congress member for me to go on social media and explain the issues, talk about her perspectives on the issues, and really bring that to light in a way that they're just not doing at the time, right?
Yeah, I remember the way that I kind of got in, because, you're an intern, you're not really sure how to raise your hand and ask for that stretch assignment just yet. And I remember, and CHCI is really good about, helping you learn how to network and be that person. But I remember my way of getting in was I counted the number of tweets, the number of followers, the number of, just like the engagement overall. And I presented an analysis to the communications director. Well, at the time it was the person who was overseeing me. She was under the deputy communications director. And I remember she was like, oh, that's impressive. No one's really tracking that. And I was like, well, why not? And so that kind of led into like, well, what else can I do around social media? Because they didn't have anyone dedicated to that. And yeah, and then from there, it just kind of grew into more assignments, more research around certain issues, things like immigration, transportation, labor. And I was with the congressman for 3 months. I wanted to stay, but as you mentioned, I had to come back and finish school. So it was a very short-lived experience, very rewarding.
So before flying back to LA at the time, in your mind, did you feel like you were going to be this deputy communications director? Like you're like, I'm going to come back and have that job once this internship happens and once I graduate, or like what was going through your head career wise?
I wanted to be press secretary for the congressman. And so my new vision for myself was like, all right, I'm going to go back, finish school. I'm going to come back to DC. I'm going to be a press secretary for either an elected official or join the administration, whoever will take me. But I want that press gig. Like I want to be representing someone who is aligned with my values and my politics and all of that good stuff. And so that was the vision. I came back on this high to LA thinking that that's what I was going to do. And
okay, so
it didn't end up being that way.
I was going to say, I'm like, so you came back and clearly that's what happened or not. So you came back to school. How long did it take you to finish school once you came back? And what happens shortly after graduation?
Yeah, it took me another 2 years. And so I think it was a grueling 2 years because, as I mentioned to you, DC really flipped that switch for me. Whereas maybe my time prior leading up to that, I wasn't really as focused as I thought I was. And after DC, I was on this high to just do everything I could to kind of just move things forward. And I remember I came back and I felt like this hot shot, having done this, congressional internship. I started applying to all these major PR firms in LA while going to school for more internships. And I was getting nothing but no everywhere. And I was getting so discouraged. But I remember thinking like, okay, well, that was one opportunity. Like you just got to keep going. And I ended up meeting a friend from high school who said he was working at a top PR firm at the time. Had me apply. I interviewed, didn't get it. But then he was like, hey, I used to work for someone who worked here and they now have their own PR firm. You should talk to them. And so I was like, all right, cool. So while I was going to school full time, I was still working. I went back to my retail job because I had to pay some bills. And then I remember at the time I had a really old, like janky car. So I was doing this hustle circuit. What I called it was I'd wake up, I'd park my car, I'd ride the metro to school. I ride the bus to school, the metro to downtown LA where I worked, and then back home, and then I'd go to my retail job. And so I met with my friend's old boss, and he had this PR firm, and he was like, we're not hiring, but why don't you start off as like an unpaid internship? And I was like, I'll take what I can get. That kind of allowed me to segue into more of the social media work in communications, which is what I was looking for, and eventually got hired on as a full-time paid intern doing like nonprofit social media work for them.
So I love two things in that segment of your story. Three things. One, the hustle, right? Like you're just like, I'm going to just make it work no matter what. Two, right. I love that you insert that you're going to school and you have your retail job because you're trying to pay some bills and you're thinking about, well, that's not a good resume builder for my career, knowing what I want to do. So how do I do something even if it's an unpaid internship, right? And then three, the fact that you actually took an unpaid internship that then led to a paid internship. I feel like that's very unique, right? In that, I don't want to advocate for free labor, right? But
absolutely not.
But yeah, I do see the value in recognizing that this could have something for you, even if it's not paying you, because you have a job that's paying you, you're going to school. So in theory, you could just stop there. But in your mind, you're like, okay, but I want to continue to build my resume so that I don't get as many no's in the future, right? How do I keep adding to that resume? So I think that was a really unique strategy.
Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, that was the result of a lot of no's, So for me, I was getting to the point where I was like, damn, I'm really not getting anything. And I remember having a conversation with a couple of mentors and just getting some of that feedback. Like if this is sort of a long-term strategy for you, you may have to opt into an unpaid internship. And I can probably talk hours about, not advocating for free labor because when I took it, it actually took some internal advocacy to switch it and make it a paid internship. And so, I think when I look back on those specific years, it was very much a grind and hustle chapter of my life where, even when I would just go on walks or I would go deliver some mail or something, whatever my task was as an intern, I'd be like, oh, this is a lot of work, but it'll be worth it one day. And I have to say it was. I learned a lot, but it's part of the journey,
How are you finding these mentors? You've mentioned them a few times, and they clearly seem to play a pivotal role in your decision making for your career and probably beyond. But how are you finding these folks?
My first real mentor, I think, came to me in high school. My professional mentor. I'd say my mom's my real mentor, but my first real mentor. But my first professional mentor came to me in high school, and I think as I began growing my network of professionals, like-minded people who I've looked up to, I've been very intentional about my follow-ups and about what that alignment looks like, right? And so for me, if I meet someone that has either had a similar background as me, comes from my neighborhood or community or similar communities, or has a trajectory like the one that I want to kind of step into, then I'm very intentional about connecting with them and following up. And it's something that I think is taken a lot of practice over the years. But what I have found is that people usually are willing to help you out and be a mentor if you're intentional about it. And so I wouldn't say I have that many, like a bunch of mentors, but I have a select few that I know that that's sort of the organic way of establishing that relationship.
Absolutely. And I've had a previous guest here call it basically their board of directors or advisory board, where like you have a select few, but these are the folks that you're not going to make a big career decision without talking to them about it. You're not going to like job search and not let them know that where your head is at the time of what you're trying to do. And I think there's so much value that comes with that, right? And having folks that have just either walked through those same paths or, their own path, but may have some insight around it, right? And like, okay, this is what I would be looking at your age or at your point, at this point in your career. And I just think, there's no way that we know everything. And I think there's so much value in learning from other folks that have, trailblazed before us.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not a one size fits all. Just, there's also generational gaps. I think it's a balance between knowing that you don't know everything, being able to receive some direction and feedback from mentors, but also following your gut. I mean, there's been opportunities that for me personally, now that I'm older and I have some more experience under my belt, my gut was just like, that's not for you. And it works out for the best, right? So I think with time, you learn kind of how to find that balance. But I think mentors are just incredible in being able to help you along your professional journey. So anytime I can be a mentor, that's something that I also advocate for and strongly believe in.
You're doing this paid internship now, and you're still going to school, and you're still working this retail job. What happens once school is no longer in the picture? So like when you're, all right, I'm about to really graduate, what happens now?
Yeah. So when I graduated, I got my degree in organizational communications and public relations from Cal State LA. Didn't end up getting the minor in poli-sci because it would have made me stay another 2 years, but that's another story. But yeah, I think at that point, I had gotten hired as a full-time staff person at the PR firm that I was working at. So I was no longer an intern. I was working full time and going to school full time. And then the retail job, this is just a funny tidbit. The retail job I kept, and I worked with them because I'd been with them since straight out of high school. I kept it because they gave you a really fat discount. And so I used to work for Armani Exchange and they had a bunch of suits. So you would get a free suit every month. And so I used all those suits for my professional job. And so I was trying to be strategic and keeping the retail job until I couldn't anymore.
Well played. Well played.
Right. Hey, my mom taught me how to hustle. So that was the strategy behind that. But yeah, after I graduated, they offered me sort of a promotion at the firm. And it required me to leave the retail job. And so I did that for a few years. And then the managing partner at the firm that I was working at was a partner at a different firm. And it was a more lobbying firm, strictly public affairs. And the owner of that firm, the founder of that firm, was really interested in hiring me. And so in a funny way of things happening, I ended up working for both firms at the same time for a few years. One firm was strictly dedicated to more nonprofit communication, social media. The other was strictly lobbying and public affairs. And I did that because it was my way of also getting my foot into the door into more of a public affairs realm of things and government relations, which I kept being interested in. And yeah, did that for a few years until I burned out.
Got it.
And that was the next chapter.
I'd love to hear two things. One, which of those two did you enjoy the most and why? And then two, tell me about that moment when you actually felt like, okay, I'm burning out and I need to figure out the next thing.
I think because I started at the smaller firm first, I kind of grew into the second firm. And so I would say a lot of the work that I started off doing, like we were doing social media campaigns around early childhood education, things around, specifically around higher education. And so a lot of those issues that the smaller firm really focused on were near and dear to my heart, and things that have always been interested since I had worked in the congresswoman's office. What attracted me to the lobbying and public affairs firm, it felt like an elevated step for me. And, my first assignment with them was working for the San Onofre plant in San Diego and figuring out, reputational and crisis communication. And I remember at the time, I think Scandal was a big show at the time. And the way I would describe my job to people was like, well, my boss is Olivia Pope, right? It was a lot of crisis comms and things like that, strategic communication and reputation management. And I fell in love with that. Like, I was like, oh, this is my bread and butter. It was great until, working for two firms at the same time, it was a lot of figuring out really how to manage your time, but also divide it in a way where, your passion is maybe in some certain areas and certain issues, but you also have a whole suite of other clients that you're trying to support and service. And so it got to the point where it was just too much. And personally, I think it was taking a toll. I mean, I was going to events every night and just figuring out, I was staying till like 10 p.m. And all that to say, I think it's just the firm was growing pretty rapidly, and I had to make a decision whether I was going to grow with the firm or find a new journey.
Two questions. One, and I'm going to keep the
Sure.
scheme of two questions at a time, right? Was there a boiling point or a breaking point that you're like, okay, I need to like make a move? And then two, despite that, what was the next move and how did you land on that?
I think it was more of a culmination of a lot of things. I think for me, the vision that I had set out myself at the beginning of that chapter when I was working for those two firms, it wasn't my reality anymore. Like the vision was just not looking what I had imagined. And I feel like through every chapter of my life, once that starts to happen, I think that's an indicator for me to figure a next step. And I decided that I was going to be open about it with my directors. And I told them, this is how I'm feeling. I want to be honest. And I'll say at the time I wasn't making a lot of money. And for all that work and all that hustle, for me, it was almost like, this is all great. I'm getting the experience, but at which point do I start to make a little bit more money that is sustainable for me personally? And so I had to figure out that for myself. And ultimately, it meant me leaving. And I have to say, my bosses were very supportive. They understood where I was coming from and actually offered to keep me. But I, at that point, was just like, no, this is something I need to do for myself. And I decided to move on. The next step was moving to a new city for a new gig. So my mentor, same one that, was trying to get me to go to DC, came back around and was like, hey, there's an opportunity in San Diego with Wells Fargo. And we're looking for someone who can join, who has your similar background. I was like, why not? And so went through the process, and the goal for them as a Western region communications team was essentially to have someone in San Diego who would serve as a spokesperson and be sort of the frontline person for the press, but also be able to deliver on strategic communications for that region. This was at the time when Wells Fargo was going through their biggest crisis ever with their sales scandal. And for me, I didn't want to go work for a big bank because that to me was selling out. And I felt like I'm not going to be that person. And I have to say, what made me do it once I got the opportunity and I got the offer was it literally was what I went to school for, right? And so for me, in my eyes, this was the opportunity to showcase that I had the skill set, the technical skills to succeed in a role like that. And if I'm being completely honest, that was going to be my press secretary role. And so to me, I was like, well, I didn't go that route. This is it. You're going to get to be the face of the bank. And what I kept telling myself at the time was, if not you, who? Like, you know who you are, you know your values as a person and as a professional. Go in, make your mark, and shake things up. And that's what I tried to do. I was there 3 years.
That's great. So, I think you've done a really good job at balancing, even before getting to Wells Fargo, right? Like balancing two jobs is a lot. Balancing a job, internship, and school is a lot, right? And you've been like kind of doing all that. I think you're also really good at communicating and having clearly, because you're a communications professional, but like having everybody on the same page, right? Like you had both of your supervisors at different firms. Granted, they know about each other and they know that you're doing this, right? But like articulating your message and having that leadership kind of be supportive of your goals, I think it also says a lot about not only the folks that were around you, but yourself and the way that you kind of set that up. So kudos to you, and ditto also as you think about other folks that are reaching out to you for opportunities and saying, hey, I thought of you for this. That is a testament to you. That is a testament to your work. That is a testament to folks being willing to expose opportunities to you in a way that, like that's putting their own brand and reputation on the line as well sometimes, right? When it's like, hey, I'm not giving you a job, but like I'm inviting you to like explore this and see if it's a good fit for either one. So you're going through that process. Good for you. So, I'm just acknowledging that you've done a really good job at owning your career and at like doing the things that set you up for success. And, I don't think that that's always the case. I think a lot of times we let the winds kind of blow us in different directions and we're like, oh, I kind of landed here. And it's like, no, you did a lot of things to kind of set yourself up there. So,
I think it's easy to think that once you kind of let yourself go. And thank you. I appreciate you saying that very kind words. I think for me, and this is kind of going into that chapter, I would say Wells Fargo, that chapter reminded me or opened my eyes to the reality that my own professional growth and development was in my own hands. And so to that point, I think it was a lot of seeking mentorship, seeking advice, navigating new spaces, and just trusting the process. But years of hard work, I would say. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So tell me about your Wells Fargo gig. What were you actually tasked with doing? How bad did the crisis actually turn out to be? Right. It's one thing to look at it from outside. And for those that may not know, like what was actually happening and what was your role in mitigating that?
At the time, a couple of years prior, Wells Fargo had been involved in a sales scandal where a lot of employees were being encouraged to up their sales, and it was sales practices that had gone wrong, and they were being sued for that. It was a huge lawsuit that turned into their biggest reputational bubble. And for communicators, that's like a case study in reputation management, right? Anyone who works in PR will know, and I still have a lot of friends who kind of have PTSD from that. So my role was essentially serving as, so it was communications consultant. And I eventually, at the time when I left as assistant vice president of corporate communications. And I was essentially the spokesperson for the bank for San Diego and the Inland Empire in Southern California. So two big regions, two big markets. And essentially that involved everything from internal, external communications. So writing press releases, being the one who answered the call from the media, and then putting together events and then working with our public affairs team members to lead social initiatives around, whatever the bank was interested in at the time. And so it definitely prepped me for the gig that I have now, but that role was very much strategic communications and public relations and a lot of media.
Got it. Okay. So you did that for about 3 years or so.
3 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Growing 3 years.
And tell me what led to your decision to move on from there and what happens next?
Yeah. I think there was a a shift in the culture at Wells Fargo. I believe strongly in the work that we were doing as communicators. For me personally, as a communicator of color, I was one of a group of communicators that could talk to Spanish media and be that type of spokesperson. And so I learned a lot on the gig, but it got to a point where the corporate culture was just something that was out of alignment for me. Working in public relations, specifically in crisis communication and reputation management, it's a lot of 24/7 work. And so I definitely feel like my point of burnout in my previous gig with the two firms set me up for success for Wells, because I was already used to it. I mean, you couldn't throw anything at me that I probably hadn't already either done or managed in some way, shape, or form before. But it took a toll on me, I think, emotionally and physically. And also I was in a different city. So even though I was still close to, I was about 2 hours from LA, I was there by myself, right? It was during that time that the pandemic started. And so there was just a lot of things. I definitely felt like it was my time to go. And there was also at the time a lot of layoffs happening, a lot of rumors that our division, there was going to be a mass layoff. And so culturally, there was just a lot of things that didn't sit well with me. And I made the decision to proactively seek new employment. And again, went the same route. I informed my manager and they were very supportive. I remember I found Kaiser on LinkedIn, and I decided to apply on a whim. And it was one of those things where you just apply and you kind of forget about it, and it just came right back at the perfect time.
That's great. I will say, for those listening, I can be a testament to that. I've gotten 2 roles through LinkedIn, and it's certainly one of those that you just kind of try and apply and see what's going on, and then someone reads your resume and your application and says, "Oh, there's something here. Let's talk to this person." So that makes a lot of sense, and good for you. Good for you for recognizing again, kind of like that moment, right? Like I think it's hard sometimes to move on and to leave. A lot of times there's comfort in at least knowing where you are and knowing what your leadership is, and kind of, yes, there's some culture changes. There's, I'm sure, some folks that kind of stuck through that, and there's value in both, right? In both approaches, but like recognizing that moment for you where like, you know what, I need something else for myself right now. That's huge. That's huge. Do you like your job right now?
I do. I enjoy my job very much. I think as I mentioned earlier, it was one of those things where I have to be honest, I kind of feel like I fell into it by mistake sometimes, because when I applied for the job, the public affairs manager title, I thought it was going to have a lot more like media relations and sort of kind of what I was doing before. And I'm not doing any of that anymore. And so when I actually got to San Francisco and dealt with the move and all of that stuff, and I started doing the work, it was more partnership development and community relations. And so this type of work is really equivalent, I would say, to your like social impact or corporate social responsibility role. And so for me, that was sort of at the long-term side of my plan. And I think for me, once I got here and realized that it would be an integral part of my role and my scope of work, I was ecstatic, because I was like, oh, this is the gift. Like, this is what you work for. And now you get to make an impact through your work. And so it's allowed me to more directly impact the communities that we serve and play a role in just not only like elevating our brand, but like actually moving us in the direction that we want to be in, right? As a mission-led organization and healthcare system. So yeah, I didn't think, if you told me, back in high school or college that I would be working in healthcare, I'd probably laugh at you, but that's my reality now. And I've learned a lot, and I continue to learn. Like every day there's something new. And I joined during the pandemic, so I don't recommend someone joining, a healthcare organization during the thick of a pandemic, but it allowed me to really, really just kind of jump in and get my hands dirty.
I'm glad you mentioned the impact, right? Because I think that's one of the reasons why I started this show, was to highlight that you can have good impact and make good money. Like, I think a lot of times we think you're either going to sell your soul and go work at something that you're going to hate forever, but you're going to be pretty successful at it, right? Or you're going to go do some good, but be broke forever. And I'm like, that's not even true. That's just not true. So tell me, could be a range, but what does someone in your type of field, in your type of career right now, what does someone like that make?
I'll preface that by saying that it really depends kind of where you're located, I would say first. Every market's different. I live in San Francisco where the cost of living is a lot higher than probably, LA or San Diego or other places in California or across the US. I think for this particular role, you can make anything between like 100 to 160K, depending on your experience, depending on your location, and depending on the industry. I also live in the tech backyard. And so, there's probably counterparts that are making a lot more than that, but it kind of just depends. I would say the average is between like 100 and 160K.
What kind of doors do you think a role like this opens for you, right? So I'm not saying you're looking for a new role, but whether that's tomorrow or 10 years from now, you're like, you know what, now I want to try something else. Yeah. What kind of things could you do from this moment in your career?
Yeah, I think the beauty with my role specifically, because I wear many hats. I'm sort of a generalist, if you will, in public affairs, and I can draw from the different disciplines that I've had in my overall experience, from government relations to corporate communications and now community relations. I think there's sort of a clear path to go in sort of a external affairs / maybe corporate social responsibility, more specific role. There's a lot of talk about ESG now and what that means for different organizations and companies. And so, there's a clear path there, but I would say I would look at it in terms of what haven't I done and what do I want to learn more about, right? Like for me, this is something that I didn't really have the experience in directly. Like I had done some of this kind of work before, but it wasn't my day to day. And now that I'm doing it, it's like, okay, I'm learning. And so as long as I'm learning, I feel like there's always going to be a path forward. I think where you cut off that learning is where you're starting to think, all right, maybe there's something else that I want to explore.
That's a great perspective. In terms of learning, is there any media that you have consumed that you think has shaped you personally or professionally? That could be books, movies, shows, podcasts that you feel like, you know what, this changed the way I look at things.
Yeah. So I'm not a big reader. I have ADHD, so I'm not like the biggest reader. I did read Michelle Obama's Becoming, and that was great. I listened to it on audiobook. When I was in San Diego. And I think that was a really impactful book for me just because it really resonated, like just her experiences in her life and how she navigated certain spaces kind of just aligned with some of the experiences that I had. I listened to a lot of Jay Shetty. So On Purpose, his podcast is really good. Just in learning from like other people that he interviews and then also aligning that with like some of the meditation practices that are sort of incorporated into that. And then, for fun, I watch a lot of TV, but I would say for things that impact me, I think professionally, I would say maybe those two things. And like I said, I'm not a big reader, but I try to figure out what new podcast is around like my current work, if I can.
I asked that question that way for a very specific reason, right? I'm an auditory learner. Mm-hmm. So if I'm going to read a book, 98% of the time I'm going to listen to it, right? I live with, my spouse who's a big reader and she has several books going on at one time. And I'm like, I cannot do that, but I could listen to it. So yeah, like that's not me, but like we just consume information differently, right? Yeah. So no, I think that's great. I love that. Is there anything else we haven't covered today that the world should know about Brian?
I think that I think I'm in many ways just getting started. I think that there's a lot that I haven't done that I want to do. And I feel very grateful for just even getting this far, to be honest. And I'm excited for the road ahead. I think that I'd love to kind of continue to pay it forward in ways that maybe I haven't in the past and continue to find ways to just grow professionally, emotionally, physically. Somebody asked me the other day, like, how are you doing? I haven't talked to this person in a while. Like, I'm good. I'm over here minding my business, my health and my energy. And that's sort of been my model these past few months. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways, I'm just getting started and I'm hopeful for another kind of chapter to come.
I love that. And you're training for a marathon, so that should be exciting as well.
And I'm training for a marathon. I'm doing a Honolulu full in December. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, good luck with that and with your training. Thanks for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is fun.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and believe on the mission we're on, please like, rate, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're using, and share this podcast with your friends and your networks. Make sure you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at Career Cheat Code and tell us people or careers you would like to see highlighted. See you next week with some more cheat codes. Peace.